This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Last year, Matt Colville made a video called How Long Should an Adventure Be? If you haven't watched it, go check it out because it's really well done. It's all about Matt basically addressing the fact that our community typically plays these long, expansive, pre-written campaigns, and how those are probably the wrong kind of adventure to structure your campaign around, especially if this is your first time running D&D. He instead recommends the practice his groups have always used, stringing a bunch of smaller adventures together rather than using one mega adventure as the foundation for the entire campaign. And it's really great advice. But there's something he didn't really get into in the video, and that's exactly how to connect these adventures together. Essentially, how do you structure a campaign? And so that's a question that I'm going to do my best to answer. I'm going to make a bunch of videos about campaign structure and the different formats your campaign could take because there's way more than I can tackle in just this one video. Before we get into all of that, we have to start by defining our terms. So I just want to use this video to establish a baseline. What is a campaign? First of all, just a very simple definition. A campaign is the term for a series of adventures played with the same group of characters. That's it. Sometimes the adventures can all be linked together, and sometimes they're all independent episodic stories that don't have anything to do with each other. Those are both still campaigns. Sometimes the campaign lasts for just a couple of weeks, and other times it can last for several years. But basically, a campaign is any number of sessions telling the same story, or even a bunch of different stories, with the same characters. Which essentially means that when we get the scene from the first episode of Stranger Things...
The campaign took 2 weeks to plan. How was I supposed to know it was going to take 10 hours?
You've been playing for 10 hours?
That's technically not the correct way to use the term, since they're just playing one long session. It's not a big deal, they're children, and they're fictional, but I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. But of course, one problem that Matt touches upon in this video is that, for a lot of people, a campaign has a very clear structure. Just one long adventure. Something like Curse of Strahd or Out of the Abyss, where the characters start somewhere from level 1 to 3, and over the course of the story they end at something like 10th or 11th level. That's certainly not true for everyone, but because people learn to play by buying these adventures, they often assume this is what a campaign is supposed to look like. However, what Matt didn't discuss is the other dream campaign so many of us wish we could play through. The level 1 to 20 campaign. Something in the vein of a Critical Role campaign where the story might be divided into several smaller story arcs that last for 10 or 15 sessions, but the entire campaign can take several years and end in a huge, epic storyline. And of course, we all know why both of these campaign concepts are so tempting. Players want the chance to take a character from low levels to the height of their power and get the chance to explore all of the cool abilities they unlock at the highest level of play. And a lot of game masters want to tell epic stories that span several levels so they can also have these amazing adventures that take the party from zeros to heroes. Or maybe they just want to use a lot of different monsters with lots of different challenge ratings. That's fine too. Again, this obviously isn't universal. There are plenty of players and game masters who are perfectly happy running self-contained adventures or shorter campaigns. Clearly, Matt Colville is one of them. But to be honest, if you're that type of player or GM, you don't really need to be told that those types of campaigns exist. You're already running them, or playing in them. Instead, it's the people who want to run or play in these long-running campaigns who probably need some help figuring out how to make sure their campaigns don't lose steam or burn out. So they need to learn that there are other ways to run your campaign. So first, let's take a look at the official advice the game designers have offered us about how to run our campaigns. In the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, the advice on building a campaign is broken into 2 sections. First, towards the beginning of the book, there's advice on building your full campaign. And here's the introductory advice. Planning an entire campaign might seem like a daunting task, but you don't have to plot out every detail right from the start. You can start with the basics, running a few adventures, and think about larger plot lines you want to explore as the campaign progresses. You're free to add as much or as little detail as you wish. The start of a campaign resembles the start of an adventure. You want to jump quickly into the action, show the players that adventure awaits, and grab their attention right away. Give the players enough information to make them want to come back week after week to see how the story plays out. And then the book suggests you start small, just by creating a local area. Make a home base for the players, then a local region around it with some dungeons and some other adventure locales, which is theoretically covered in another chapter of the book. And then they recommend you craft a starting adventure, which is, again, theoretically covered in another chapter. Then they suggest you give your players no more than 2 pages of prep material about the game, and then let your players create characters and use those characters and their backstories to fill in more details about your campaign. For example, if a player has the hermit background, figure out what secret that character has figured out about the world. If someone is playing a noble, integrate their noble family into the setting. That kind of thing. And this is not bad advice. Wait, actually, if someone just gives you the most broad, unhelpful suggestions, is that actually bad advice? Like if I say eat healthy, but I don't explain how or what that means, does that become bad advice because it's so vague, or is it only bad advice if it's harmful? Anyway, moving on, because 6 chapters later we get the chapter titled Between Adventures, and this is apparently where they decided to put some more advice about structuring your campaign, because while I think this book does have useful advice and resources scattered throughout it, the organization of this book is insanely bad. But here's how this chapter opens. A campaign is much more than a series of adventures. It also includes the moments between them, the various distractions and side pursuits that engage the characters when they're not exploring the wilderness, plundering dungeons, and gallivanting around the multiverse on some epic quest. The natural pace of a campaign offers lulls between adventures, time for the characters to spend their treasure and pursue their goals. This downtime gives the characters an opportunity to sink their roots a little deeper into the world, building a personal investment in what happens to the people and places around them, which can, in turn, draw them into further adventures. And then the book discusses different approaches to linking adventures together. Either these adventures are completely disconnected, like an episodic TV show, in which case you don't have to link them together at all, or you tell an overarching story. Then they give us 2 examples of good structures for ongoing campaigns. The first is The Quest of Many Parts. And again, I'm going to read this one aloud. You can tie adventures together using an overarching goal that can be fulfilled only by first completing a series of related quests. For example, you could create a villain who can't be defeated until the characters explore 9 dungeons in which the 9 Dread Princes reside, with each of these dungeons stocked with enough monsters and hazards to advance the adventurers 2 or 3 levels. The adventurers spend their whole careers fighting the 9 Dread Princes before finally pursuing an epic quest to destroy the prince's monstrous progenitor. As long as every dungeon is unique and interesting, your players will appreciate the tight focus of the campaign. In a similar type of quest campaign, the adventurers might need to collect fragments of an artifact that are scattered in ruins across the multiverse, before reassembling the artifact and using it to defeat a cosmic threat. And I honestly think this is basically the prototypical fantasy adventure, and so it's basically the de facto approach for a lot of our ideas of what a campaign looks like. Curse of Strahd takes this format directly, and I'd argue Prince of the Apocalypse kind of does as well, but you can also see this format in something like Hades. Fight your way through a bunch of dungeons and bosses to get to the final boss. Or Pokemon. Fight all the gym leaders before you can face the Elite Four. Now, the other campaign format they suggest is Agents of X. You can also build a campaign around the idea that the adventurers are agents of something larger than themselves, a kingdom or secret organization, for example. Wherever their allegiance lies, the adventurers are motivated by loyalty and the goal of protecting whatever it is they serve. The characters' overarching mission might be to explore and map an uncharted region, forging alliances where they can and overcoming threats they encounter along the way. Their goal might be to find the ancient capital of a fallen empire, which lies beyond the realm of a known enemy and forces them to navigate hostile territory. The characters could be pilgrims in search of a holy site, or members of a secret order dedicated to defending the last bastions of civilization in an ever-declining world. Or they might be spies and assassins, striving to weaken an enemy country by targeting its evil leaders and plundering its treasures. This is Star Wars, where the heroes are rebels or Jedi Knights or resistance fighters battling evil across the galaxy. But it's also Star Trek, with Federation ships visiting unknown worlds. It's the Suicide Squad being sent out on deadly missions by the US government. And it's also Supernatural, with the Winchesters traveling across the country, fighting demons and cryptids. Any West Marches game probably follows this format, as well as any exploration-heavy adventures like Tomb of Annihilation, and arguably Dungeon of the Mad Mage, since, despite the implications of the term, Agents of X, the characters in this type of campaign don't actually have to have a specific patron, just a general shared objective. Then the chapter suggests some ways to plant seeds for adventures, basically just how to get these plot hooks in front of your players. Things like finding notes on a villain's corpse, or finding a wanted poster, or the players get an anonymous letter hinting at something they hadn't yet worked out on their own. And then there's some examples of foreshadowing for future adventures, like finding a symbol of an unknown organization engraved or written on something carried by an enemy. And that's a great one. I've been a player in a few campaigns where that was the first hint of foreshadowing for a larger story, and I found that that's really effective. There's also other good ones here, like a series of similar murders, or someone shouting a prophecy on the street, or a puppet show warning that the 2 noble families' feud will end in catastrophe. That's a good one. I'll have to use that one. I definitely feel like my players will respond well to the idea of an entertainer using their art and their platform to express apprehension about an upcoming political shift. That just feels like something that would resonate with my friends for some reason. And finally, this chapter offers some suggestions for how to take notes for your campaign. And then it's got recurring expenses and downtime activities because, once again, the arrangement of this book is very goofy. But fortunately, they just made a new Dungeon Master's Guide, and now there's a lot of useful advice for creating a campaign. Get this, all in the same chapter, and in an order that makes sense. First of all, it comes after the chapter about creating adventures, which is great because it helps to remind a new game master that their primary focus should be on running the next adventure, rather than putting all their efforts into prepping a long-running campaign at the expense of the adventures themselves. Then the book offers the following suggestions for actually prepping your campaign. Figure out the premise, integrate your characters and come up with a strong start, plan adventures, and figure out how you might want it to end and what level you want to play to. I think that's really important to establish so your players know how long this campaign might go. But notice, This list of campaign tasks doesn't say that you should prep the entire level 1 to 20 campaign and all the adventures contained within. And I think that's where a lot of us get tripped up. At least, I know this would happen to me. We spend so much time planning out what we hope might happen and all the adventures we want to run, because it's so tempting and tantalizing. But that often means that we don't put as much focus on just prepping the next couple of adventures instead. And that's really what we ought to do. Just focus on the next couple of sessions and then wait and see where the campaign could go from there. Next, there's a section on taking notes, including an example of a journal page you could print out and use. And while I don't know if this is how I would take notes, I do really like two things about this page. One, the notes page includes 3 sections. All details that might be relevant to this session, your plan for what you expect to happen in this session, and notes you can take during the session. As someone who is terrible at taking notes during a game, having a journal page for my D&D prep that also includes a section for me to take notes mid-session might be exactly the solution I need to start writing down the stuff that happens during a game. But the second thing I really like about how they talk about taking notes is that they really recommend you use those notes to figure out foreshadowing after the fact. In the example provided, the players find a random trinket on a body and decide to hold onto it, which you were not expecting. You just included that detail as flavor, but now it's loot. However, according to the system they recommend, when you're prepping another adventure in the future, you can go back through your old notes, see that somebody kept that trinket, and use that as the plot hook for your next session. In their example, an NPC recognizes the trinket and approaches or confronts the party, and this NPC could be the bridge into the next quest. Essentially, this retroactively turns the trinket into foreshadowing. And this is great advice for the beginning of this chapter because it reminds you very early on that you don't need to have everything figured out by the time you start the campaign. You can figure things out as you go along. And with a few simple tricks like this one, you can make it seem like everything was all planned out in advance, and like you're a genius who actually did prep the entire campaign from the start, even though you didn't, because you don't need to and you shouldn't. This is reiterated next in the section about the premise, where they say the same thing we've been saying. A campaign is like a comic book series or a TV show, where each adventure is a self-contained story that contributes to a larger narrative. And then they remind you that a campaign story shouldn't be, and in fact can't be, predetermined, because the players will contribute and change things. And if you're too locked into your prep, you'll miss the great opportunities they give you to go in unexpected directions. And this is something we'll talk about later this year. We'll do a whole video about this. Next, there's some solid advice about how to make the characters the center of the story, and again, we'll definitely talk about that some more, a lot more, later in some upcoming videos. Then they suggest if you do want to run a long-running campaign, don't build it around one conflict. Instead, introduce 3 conflicts early in the campaign. That way, different subplots can come and go for the main narrative. We can see this approach in action in the Vox Machina campaign. The Chroma Conclave storyline was foreshadowed with General Krieg in Amon in the pre-stream game, and then we got the Briarwoods and the Cult of Vecna, and once they were dealt with, the Chroma Conclave stepped back in the spotlight. But all the while, the players are still investigating Vecna and the Briarwoods and dealing with the fallout of that storyline. And then at any given point, they might deal with some completely unrelated D&D adventure like the quest into the Underdark or the missions for the Slayer's Take. And in fact, Matt Mercer is really good at sitting on old dangling loose threads and bringing them back as another X factor that's unrelated to the main storyline. Like when the Rakshasa returned for vengeance against Vax in the middle of a big important Chroma Conclave storyline. Having multiple storylines folding in and out of the narrative helps keep things exciting for the players, but they also give the players a chance for victories. After all, let's imagine Batman fights the Joker and wins, and then the Joker shows up in the next storyline. That doesn't feel good for the next adventure to be another Joker fight. It feels like, well, what was the point if he was just going to show up right away immediately? You gotta let the Joker sit on the back burner for a while and let Batman fight Ra's al Ghul or Bane or Maxi Zeus or the Clock King. And then when the Joker returns, you don't have that same feeling of redundancy as if he'd come back immediately. But you still get to move the Joker storyline forward by having his return pay off old plot threads and reinforce the themes that were present the last time he showed up. I realize that the idea that the Joker isn't the villain of every Batman story might seem completely alien to some of you, since every Batman story these days seems to either feature the Joker as the main villain, or he shows up in the final scene because he's going to be the villain next time. But I promise, there are Batman stories out there where the Joker is present, but not constantly the main villain. It can be done. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but the end of this chapter has a section about Greyhawk, which I discussed in a different video, but their version of Greyhawk also follows this same recommendation, to have more than one big sinister threat for your heroes to deal with. And honestly, this isn't a piece of advice I hear all that often, but it's one that I definitely agree with, and I think we should carry with us when designing our campaigns. Not just because it keeps the campaign fresh, but also because it makes the world feel more nuanced. I think any campaign that is entirely focused on one evil threat just feels so artificial. There can and should be some other evil threats out there that the heroes might have to deal with, just so the world feels bigger than just this one bad guy or one evil cult or one apocalyptic threat. Honestly, that's half the challenge we have as Dungeon Masters, just trying to fool our players into believing this artificial world is real, so they can allow themselves to suspend their disbelief. Of course, it's easier said than done, but the good news is that there are a ton of different ways to make your players believe in the world you've created for them. For example, one solution is for you to show your work. Show them that you've put some thought into it, that you've typed up some material that they can read on their own. The best way to do that is to use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that gives you all the tools you need to present your world to your players. You can create wiki-style articles about your world and then share those links with your group. And these articles can literally be about anything. Locations like bustling cities or fallen temples. NPCs like kindly tavern owners or sinister cultists. Monsters, magic items, anything you can think of, World Anvil has a template for it. And each template comes with prompts that can help you flesh out your setting in more detail than you can come up with on your own. Of course, it sure would be nice if it was easy to access the material during your game. Except, actually, it is easy to access because World Anvil has a digital GM screen, so you can access your entire world while also referencing your players' character sheets and sending them notes with how much XP they're getting and what loot they recover. And in fact, you can just have everyone roll their dice through World Anvil because you can also play your game through the website. It's an enormously versatile tool. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you could save 51% off of any annual membership. Wait a minute, have we fallen into some sort of dream world? 51% off of your membership? Yes, that's right. 51% off of any annual membership if you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thanks so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Now, this chapter continues and goes on to offer advice about running different flavors of fantasy for your campaign, and then gives some advice on the advantages of running a pre-published campaign setting versus making your own campaign setting. And I've made a video about that topic before. In fact, I've got a whole other series about campaign settings. I made a video about Greyhawk, which does appear at the end of this chapter, as I referenced earlier. And then it gets into some more specific advice about how to actually start your campaign, and how to actually run adventures that are connected to each other and getting your players invested in your campaign, and even some advice on ending your campaign. And I am so excited to get into all of that, both to dig into the advice presented in this book, as well as share my own thoughts and all the nitty-gritty technical details of running a campaign, because I have a lot of opinions about the many different ways we can structure our campaigns. Personally, I've played in or run all sorts of different types of campaigns. When I got into the hobby in college, our campaigns only lasted the length of one semester, so we almost always aimed for about 13 sessions. We started around the second week of school, and we'd wrap up before final started. And each of the semesters would basically just be a self-contained campaign, completely disconnected from each other. Most of the time, our GM was the same student, my friend Daniel, and all of his games were set in the same world, and the impact of previous campaigns would continue to shape the world. But sometimes he'd also run a different game entirely, like Necessary Evil, where we all played supervillains, or someone else would run a game of D&D in their own setting. In fact, I ran one of these games, and I did a terrible job for a lot of reasons, but one of them was that I was trying to run this huge, epic, Lord of the Rings style story, but I completely failed to make the adventure about the characters in any way. All their choices were basically meaningless. I determined they were going to go for a tour of my campaign setting and hear about all the cool stuff I'd come up with, even if it wasn't going to lead anywhere satisfying. But my friends put up with it because they knew I was new to running games, and it was also only going to last 12 weeks, and then we move on to something new. But our group basically used that exact same format for all of our games, even after college. We'd play a game for half a year, or maybe a full year, playing games like Dungeon World, or the Dragon Age RPG, or a Warhammer 40k game where we were all Space Marines, or Star Wars Edge of the Empire, or Unknown Armies, and then we move on to another game. And at first, when I started running my own games for my friends in Los Angeles, I used that same format, running a 4th edition game that would run for about 12 to 13 sessions. The problem with that campaign was the same problem I've had with a lot of my recent games. I personally am terrible with scheduling. I am almost always the problem. In the case of that campaign, I think I basically just hit a wall and didn't have the energy to run more games, so I just kept putting off the next session. And in fact, the random break we took in between 2 sessions of that campaign was so long that we wound up playing a whole other campaign in between, run by my friend Jay. He pretty much wrote the entire campaign in advance, but it was also a pretty short campaign, running about 10 to 15 sessions, and set in one small sandbox location, one valley. And we would unlock different aspects of a mystery by visiting different regions and fighting different monsters. I remember being especially impressed by how the whole thing seemed planned out from the beginning, to the point where clues from the first session had satisfying payoffs in the finale. In fact, the first session opened where the last session ended, in a different part of the same dungeon, so there was this really cool sense of resolution that came from our adventure literally coming full circle at the end. So that's why in the brief window of time where my friends and I had an actual play show, we recruited Jay to run it, because he'd absolutely crushed his very first campaign. And due to the format of that show, that actual play campaign had a very specific structure. Every adventure would be run in a single session and would basically be a completely standalone quest. But over time, the adventure started having a more connective tissue in between, and so for the second half of our years-long campaign, almost all the adventures were directly tied into whatever had happened in the last session, or into one of the other subplots we had going on. But they were all still self-contained adventures that we could run in a single session. That format didn't change until we were almost 20th level, which is when the last few adventures were a bit longer and took a little bit longer to play through. In that case, the campaign was extremely episodic because we wanted our audience and our guest stars to be able to drop in at any point, but there was still a larger continuous narrative tying the episodes together. Of course, at the same time, I was running a bunch of homebrew campaigns and learning all the wrong lessons from Critical Role, so I was trying to map out these sprawling level 1 to 20 campaigns in advance, and then I'd have to abandon a lot of those plans as players kept moving away because Los Angeles was an incredibly expensive place to live. And even so, I still think I'm lucky compared to a lot of other GMs because I was at least able to run my campaigns for a while. I had a friend who spent years talking about the campaign that he wanted to run, that he was working on. It sounded like he was actively prepping it, and yet it never materialized. As far as I know, he never ran that campaign for anybody, because that tempting idea of prepping your entire campaign all in advance just meant that the work was never going to get done. But of course, everything I just discussed existed purely in the realm of homebrew adventures. I've also played in or run some published adventures, although not as many as I might like. I've tried to run Horde of the Dragon Queen twice. The first time fell apart for a bunch of reasons, and the second time ended in a TPK. Then I ran Prince of the Apocalypse for a party of 4 druids, and that lasted for a few years, with us basically playing every week. Then my brother-in-law ran us through Storm King's Thunder, which resulted in a very high-level TPK against a random encounter we weren't even supposed to interact with, but since we were so close to the ending, we rolled up some new characters and finished out the story with them. And I've also played in a Curse of Strahd campaign that took a year to get through the whole book, and I've been running a Strahd campaign that has taken almost 5 years, because, again, I am the problem. My schedule is terrible. Although part of the problem is also the way that I ran some of these games, which is definitely something we'll talk about in a later video. I'm also running a second Strahd campaign right now, and we made a lot of good progress before my child was born and I had to hit pause. But I really need to get back to both of these games and start running again for my players, which I'm honestly hoping to do very soon. But that's exactly the issue Matt Colville had with these huge pre-written adventures. If you lose momentum and stop playing for a while, then it really feels like your D&D career has stalled before you ever got a chance to experience a satisfying resolution. And I do think there's a way to run published adventures where you can build in breaks for yourself, but for a lot of these adventures, that would require a lot of work and restructuring, and it would also really require your players to be okay with taking a hiatus from a story that they're invested in. And that can be a really big ask. It would basically be like having a season finale of a TV show, a cool cliffhanger to keep their interest before a hiatus that they already knew was coming, and that has a clear endpoint. But that's something we'll almost certainly discuss in a video later this year about how to tackle pre-written adventures in a way to make them more manageable, if that is even possible. But this is an issue that I'm currently dealing with myself. My wife and our friends have started a new campaign, something we've been talking about doing for more than a year and a half before it finally happened. Although really, I'd only gotten most of those players to agree to a one-shot. And in fact, the reason my wife had felt less excited about starting another campaign is because the last one she'd been a part of, it just petered out. Just like Matt Colville discussed, is the big problem with ongoing campaigns. It was exactly the thing that he tried to warn us about. Part of the problem is also just knowing your audience. My wife doesn't really like stories that just go on endlessly. If a TV show is actually building toward the answer to some huge mystery, she would just much rather binge it all at once the show was actually done, rather than watching it week to week and waiting for a conclusion that might never come. After she watches the first episode of a show that has some big mystery element, she'll make me tell her if the show ever gets around to answering that mystery, because she doesn't want to get invested in something that's not going to have a payoff. So she didn't like a campaign that was just going on endlessly with no clear end in sight. So in order to help accommodate my players, who had either only agreed to a one-shot or had very strong feelings about not liking ongoing campaigns, this campaign is really just going to be a series of independent episodic adventures. Maybe over time I'll start seeding in some more serialization because, let's be honest, I just can't help myself, but it'll probably be subtle for a long time and just be something that my players can slowly pick up on at their own pace. I also have some other campaigns that have been in limbo since my baby was born, and while it's a little tougher to carve out time for those right now, I have the benefit of running a game with my wife as we can both take care of the baby at the table with us, but I do still want to resume all my games in the new year. But I'll definitely be rethinking my approach because, quite frankly, the format of running a game every week for years is just something that I don't have the ability to commit to these days. I need to make sure to give myself some breaks, especially since I am embarking on quite the ambitious project this year. See, in Matt Colville's video, he mentioned that you can borrow the format of an episodic TV show to tie your adventures together, but he didn't actually dive into how to do that, or what that might look like. So I've got a video coming out later this week about how we can structure our campaigns like a TV series. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because throughout this year, I'm going to be looking at a ton of TV shows, as well as some movies and comic books and video games, and I'm going to break down the lessons I think we can apply to our own games. Things like how to keep the characters central to the story, how to foreshadow future storylines, how to integrate a serialized B-plot into an episodic campaign, how to structure a story arc that builds to a resolution like we might see in a season of TV, how to handle long-running mysteries, and so much more. We'll talk about villains, alignment, central themes, cliffhangers, adaptations of magic, and real-world myths. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Yeah, considering this was going to be a year-long project with a ton of videos, I can totally understand why Matt didn't dig into all this in his one video. I'll be honest, this is going to be a huge increase in my workload. I'm not even sure how I'm going to be able to manage it.
Don't worry, you won't be doing it alone.
What the hell?
I'll be here to help the entire time.
Who the fuck are you?
I'm Oddwick, the algorithm wizard, and I'm here to help your channel grow.
Okay. Oddwick? I guess I'm a little confused. Did I summon you? Or do you work for YouTube?
No, silly. I'm just a fan of your channel, and I want to help your channel grow.
Well, that's very kind of you.
In fact, I won't be happy until you hit 100,000 subscribers.
Okay, that's very ambitious. I mean, it took me like 2.5 years to hit 50,000 subscribers. That was honestly pretty fast. Most channels don't grow that quickly.
Stick with me, and I promise you'll be at 100,000 subscribers by the end of 2025.
Whoa, that is really unrealistic. I mean, honestly, I don't see any way we could hit that goal in a year.
Well, that's because you're not an algorithm wizard, like Oddwick.
That's true.
The algorithm wizard.
That's true. Right, okay. Well, so you're the expert. Is there anything I should be doing differently?
Sure, you should do a video every day.
Well, okay, I'm not gonna do that. I can't really keep up with that schedule, but there are gonna be a couple of bonus videos this week and next week.
4 videos a week.
Well, yes, actually, if I can pull it off, it should be around 4 videos a week.
For the rest of the year.
No, just this week and next week. We're gonna do a couple of videos about campaign structure, we'll do a video about what's in my Appendix N, and a couple of videos about how to start your campaign. It should be a ton of fun. I'm really looking forward to sharing them with you.
And throw a demystified video in there too.
No demystified video this week, but there are gonna be some bonus demystified videos coming in the next couple of months.
Hooray!
If you wanna make sure you see all my videos when they come out, make sure to subscribe.
100,000 subscribers.
Just so we're on the same page. When I hit 100,000 subscribers, you go away, right?
Yes.
But until we hit that goal, you're gonna be in more of my videos.
All of them.
Okay, folks, this is Oddwick. I hope you like him because I guess he's sticking around. And if you don't like Oddwick, then please subscribe to the channel and he'll go away. But you should also subscribe so you can see all of my videos, including some really excellent bonus videos I've got planned for this month. And ring the bell so you can get notified when those videos come out because that also helps a whole lot. If you get the notification and watch a video as soon as it comes out, it also helps boost the channel. You can also support me financially on Patreon.
Call to action.
I'm very clearly doing the call to action, Oddwick.
Hooray!
You can give me money on Patreon if you want, it really helps a lot. I also have a Discord server where I'm sure people will be discussing Oddwick.
Only good things, I'm sure.
You're very cute, Oddwick. I'm sure people will be focused mostly on that. And I've got a newsletter. I'm trying to get better about using it this year, so please sign up for that as well. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. Click here. Oddwick, can you move? I need to put the end card up.
You got it.
It's gonna be a weird year, isn't it? Anyway, click here for a video I made about the recent D&D movie and the lessons we can learn from it to enhance our own games. I'm really happy with how that video came out. Until next time, play fair and have fun.